The wreckage sat in a corner of the salvage yard like a wound that refused to close. What had once been one of the most breathtaking machines ever to roll off a production line, a McLaren 720S in a custom volcano orange finish, so rare it had been mixed by hand at the McLaren Special Operations Division, was now a twisted snarl of carbon fiber and fractured ambition. The driver's side door was caved inward at a grotesque angle. The front fascia had peeled away like burned skin. The rear quarter panel had folded into the wheel well, with a violence that made even seasoned mechanics flinch when they looked at it. Shards of the custom interior leather hand, stitched in a shade of charcoal that the owner had selected herself from a catalog of 47 options, were still visible through the shattered side window, dusted with pulverized glass that caught the afternoon light and sparkled. Cruelly beautiful, like confetti at a funeral. Insurance adjusters had walked around it 3 times, clipboards in hand, shaking their heads at each pass. The verdict was unanimous, clinical, and final. Total loss. The vehicle that had once been valued at $312,000 would be sold at a salvage auction for the kind of money that barely covered a month's groceries. $500. And not one professional in that yard believed there was a single person alive who could change what it had become. Victoria Hayes had purchased the McLaren 720S on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, 3 years before the accident, arriving at the dealership in a cashmere coat and driving away 4 hours later with the keys to a machine that produced 710 horsepower and 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds. At 39, Victoria was the kind of woman whose name appeared on lists, Forbes lists, technology conference, keynote lineups, the guest rosters of charity galas hosted in glass-walled penthouses overlooking city skylines. She had built her first software company from a spare bedroom in her mid-20s and sold it at 31 for $47 million. The second company she founded went public. The third one she simply kept, because she'd learned by then that the most valuable things in life were the ones you chose not to sell. The McLaren, in a sense, was an extension of that philosophy. It was not merely a car, it was a declaration. It said, without a single word, that the woman behind the wheel had fought for every inch of the life she now commanded, and she had won. She drove it only on clear days. She kept it in a climate-controlled garage bay at her estate. She had it detailed every 3 weeks by a specialist who traveled from out of state. And on the nights she drove it, really drove it, on long stretches of open highway where she could hear the twin-turbocharged engine sing, she felt something she could not quite name, but could not live without. The night of the accident arrived without ceremony. It was a Thursday in November, and the rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, in that thin, relentless way that makes every road surface treacherous and every driver overconfident. Victoria had attended a dinner that ran long, and she had chosen to take the McLaren because she always took the McLaren when she needed to feel in control. The roads were slick. The curve was familiar, and then, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, everything changed. The rear end broke loose, in a way that even her reflexes, sharp as they were, could not correct in time. The car struck the median barrier at a speed that investigators would later estimate at 67 miles per hour, spinning twice before coming to rest against the guardrail in a cloud of steam and silence. Victoria walked away with a cracked collarbone, a deep laceration above her left eyebrow, and a tremor in her hands that would take 6 weeks to fully subside. She was, by every medical measure, extraordinarily lucky. The car was not. The car was gone. The insurance company's assessment team arrived at the salvage yard 11 days later. They moved through their checklist with the quiet efficiency of people who have already made up their minds before they begin. The structural frame had been compromised in 4 separate sections. The carbon fiber monocoque, the very backbone of the vehicle's identity, had sustained impact damage along its lower sill that rendered it non-compliant with manufacturer repair specifications. Both front suspension assemblies had sheared. The airbag system had fully deployed and could not be reset without a factory-level diagnostic and replacement procedure that would itself cost more than $40,000. The infotainment system and its associated wiring harness had been torn from their mounting points. The custom exhaust, a titanium aftermarket system that Victoria had ordered separately, and had installed by a certified tuning house in California, was bent beyond use. The engine was buried under enough debris and compressive damage that accessing it would require, the adjusters noted, the removal of virtually every surrounding panel first. They wrote their numbers. They filed their report. Total loss. The paperwork was processed. The car was logged into the salvage system, and on a gray Wednesday morning in late November, the listing went live. One McLaren 720S, salvage title. Sold as is, no warranty expressed or implied. Minimum opening bid of $500. No one placed a second bid. There was only one. Ethan Walker was 38 years old, and he had the hands of a man who had been working with metal his entire adult life, calloused at the palms, stained faintly with grease along the cuticles no matter how long he scrubbed, bearing the small white scars that collect on the hands of anyone who has spent enough years around engine bays and metal edges, and the kind of work that does not forgive inattention. He had grown up in a mid-sized city in Ohio, the son of a man who rebuilt transmissions for a living, and a mother who had kept the family's budget balanced through a combination of discipline and optimism that Ethan had inherited in roughly equal measure. He'd started working at a garage at 16, first sweeping floors and handing tools, then rebuilding carburetors, then handling full engine overhauls by the time he was 20. He was good at it genuinely, naturally, almost irritatingly good with the kind of mechanical intuition that more experienced men sometimes develop after decades of practice, but that Ethan had seemed to possess from the beginning. He had married at 26. Her name was Claire, and she had laughed at all the right moments and been serious at all the right moments, and had made their apartment feel like a home in a way that Ethan had not known he needed until she was there doing it. When their daughter Lily was born, Ethan had sat in the hospital chair beside Claire's bed in the early morning hours, holding a 7-pound, 4-ounce human being, and felt, for the first time in his life, that everything he'd ever worked toward had been pointing at exactly this moment. Claire died of a fast-moving illness when Lily was 4 years old. Ethan had not fully processed the shape of that loss even now. 4 years later, because processing it would have required sitting still long enough for it to catch him, and sitting still was a luxury that single fathers raising 8-year-old daughters simply did not have. Instead, he worked. He managed. He made lunches and checked homework and attended school plays and kept the lights on. And on the nights when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he watched restoration videos on his laptop at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, watching other people bring broken things back to life. He found the auction listing almost by accident, a link buried in a discussion thread on a forum he'd been browsing after a late shift. Someone had posted it half as a joke. Totaled McLaren, $500. Enjoy your sculpture. Ethan had clicked it thinking nothing in particular. He'd read the description. He'd looked at the damage photos, and then he'd done something that no one else in that forum thread had done. He had looked at the damage photos again, slowly, studying each one with the practiced eye of a man who had rebuilt things from far worse. The frame damage was bad, but it was localized. The engine, from what he could see, had been shielded by the front clamshell structure in a way that might have preserved it better than the adjusters assumed. The electrical damage was described as extensive, but Ethan had read enough salvage reports to know that insurance adjusters were not electricians, and extensive electrical damage on a salvage report meant anything from a melted fuse box to a completely destroyed harness, and only one of those was actually terminal. He stared at the screen for a long time. He ran the numbers in his head 3 different ways. Then he borrowed $400 from his neighbor, added it to the $112 he had in his checking account that was not earmarked for rent or groceries, and placed his bid. He won, and when the notification hit his phone the following morning, a quiet, anticlimactic ping while he was pouring cereal for Lily, he sat down at the kitchen table and held the phone in both hands and allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the full size of what he'd just done. Then Lily looked up from her bowl and said, "What's wrong, Dad?" And he said, "Nothing, baby, nothing at all," and meant it more than he had in a very long time. The flatbed truck delivered the McLaren to Ethan's garage on a Friday afternoon in late November, and the 3 men who ran the salvage yard's transport service spent approximately 4 minutes on the premises before getting back in their cab and driving away, because there was nothing about what they had just done that required further discussion. The car sat there in the fluorescent light of Ethan's rented garage bay, like a question with no obvious answer. Lily had come to watch the delivery, bundled in her winter coat, and she stood at the edge of the bay holding a thermos of hot chocolate that Ethan had made her, and looked at the wreckage with the particular expression that 8-year-olds have when they are trying to decide whether to be worried or excited, and have not yet made up their minds. Ethan began his assessment at 6:30 that evening. After Lily was home with their neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, looking after her, he started at the outside and worked inward, which is the only logical way to approach a machine you do not yet understand. He walked around the perimeter 4 full times, crouching at different points, shining his flashlight along the body lines, pressing his fingers along the carbon fiber panels to feel for the particular give that indicates subsurface fracture. He photographed everything over 200 photographs in the first 2 hours alone, organized by zone, by component, by damage type. Then he began removing panels. What he found surprised him. Not because the damage was less than reported, in some respects it was worse, but because the distribution of that damage was entirely different from what the insurance assessment had suggested. The frame had indeed been compromised, but the critical impact points were in sections that a skilled fabricator could address with the right equipment and technique. The carbon fiber monocoque had taken a hit along the sill, but Ethan, running his hands carefully along the damage in the early hours of the morning, could feel that the structural integrity of the tub itself, the core safety cell that surrounded the driver, was intact. The adjusters had written it off as a unit, but the damage was not uniform. It was specific, localized, and, in some sections, actually repairable by someone willing to do the work properly. The engine was the revelation. When Ethan finally accessed the power unit after 4 hours of careful disassembly, removing the rear clamshell and the associated panels piece by piece, he found a 4-liter twin-turbocharged Vate that had been protected by the structural geometry of the car's rear section, almost as though the engineers had designed it specifically to survive this kind of lateral impact. There were sensor failures. There were damaged ancillary components. The dry sump oil system had a crack in one of its secondary lines, but the block itself, the heads, the turbos, they were intact. He sat on a plastic crate in the middle of the garage at 2 in the morning and stared at the engine and felt something settle in his chest like a key turning in a lock. He called Lily at 8 the next morning. She was awake. She was always awake early, and told her what he'd found. She listened with the serious attention that she brought to things that mattered to her. And then she said, "So you can really fix it?" And Ethan, who had spent the intervening hours running numbers and making lists and trying to calculate the realistic probability of success, said, "I think so, Lil. I really think so." There was a pause, and then she said, "Dad, do you think the car wants to be fixed?" And Ethan laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a while, and said, "Yeah, baby, I think it does." The plan, reduced to its simplest form, was this: 30 days, working nights and weekends, alongside his regular job, using his own labor in place of shop rates, sourcing used parts and fabricating custom replacements wherever possible, and keeping total expenditure under $18,000, the amount he could theoretically recover by selling the car afterward, based on conservative market research. If the restoration was completed to a high enough standard, the plan, in its full complexity, involved approximately 47 separate tasks broken into 3 phases: structural, mechanical, and finishing, each dependent on the completion of the one before it, each carrying its own weight of variables and risks and potential failure points. He wrote it all down in a spiral notebook in his small, precise handwriting, and taped it to the wall of the garage where he could see it every night. The first week was demolition and assessment, which sounds less heroic than it was. Ethan stripped the car to its essential components during a series of long nights, working from 9 in the evening until 2 or 3 in the morning, then waking at 6:30 to get Lily ready for school, then working his regular shift at the garage until 6. He slept in 4 to 5 hour intervals. He drank a great deal of coffee, He watched instructional content on McLaren-specific electrical systems during his lunch breaks, pausing and rewinding, taking notes in the margins of his notebook, developing a working familiarity with a vehicle platform far more complex than anything he had professionally encountered before. The people around him, his colleagues at the garage, his neighbor across the hall, a few friends he still saw occasionally, all had variations of the same response when he told them what he was doing. The word they used most often was crazy. One colleague said, flatly, "Ethan, man, the insurance company has teams of people who look at this stuff for a living. If they said it's gone, it's gone." Ethan thanked him for the input and went back to work. He sourced parts from 4 different states, a used front suspension assembly from a McLaren that had been in a flood in Texas, a set of replacement sensors and control modules from a parts dealer in California who specialized in exotic salvage, carbon fiber repair materials from a supplier in North Carolina who serviced aerospace contractors and had the kind of product quality that Ethan needed for the sill repair. He spent hours on the phone negotiating prices, explaining his project, asking questions. Some sellers were skeptical and declined to deal with him. Others were intrigued and sent parts at cost. One elderly man in Michigan who had a workshop full of McLaren components he'd collected over 15 years, simply because he loved the cars, talked to Ethan for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon and then sent him a box of parts he refused to be paid for, with a note that said, simply, "Good luck, son. Send me a picture when you're done." Day 10 arrived with the weight of a verdict. Ethan had been working on the electrical system for 3 consecutive nights, a labyrinthine network of wiring and control modules that in a modern supercar functions more like a nervous system than a simple circuit, responsive and adaptive and intolerant of error. He had mapped the harness. He had identified the damaged sections. He had sourced replacement modules that, while not new from the factory, were in working condition and properly coded for this generation of vehicle. He had done everything right. And then, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, while attempting to restore power to the dashboard control cluster, something in the secondary power distribution network failed in a way he had not anticipated, not because he had made an error, exactly, but because the vehicle had sustained a hidden fault that the disassembly had finally exposed. A capacitor in one of the advanced driver assistance system modules discharged incorrectly through a pathway it was not supposed to use, and the resulting surge damaged 3 control units that had, up to that moment, been functional. The silence in the garage afterward was the loudest silence Ethan had ever heard. He sat on the floor beside the chassis and looked at what he was dealing with and did the calculation in his head without wanting to. The replacement modules he would need cost, used and sourced as cheaply as he could find them, approximately $2,400. He had $912 left in the project fund. He had no credit cards with available balance. His regular paycheck would not arrive for another 11 days, and it would be largely consumed by rent and utilities and Lily's school expenses. He sat on that garage floor for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent light above him flickered twice, long enough that a cold draft came in under the bay door and reminded him that it was nearly midnight in December. He thought about Claire. He thought about how she had always been the one who could look at a problem and find the part of it that was solvable, and how much he missed having that voice to turn to. He thought about Lily asleep in the apartment. He thought about what it would mean to haul this car back to a salvage yard and try to sell it for parts, which would cover maybe a third of what he'd spent so far. He thought about all of that, and then he drove home. He did not hear Lily come into the kitchen. She was wearing her pajamas with the small yellow stars on them, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. And she stood in the doorway looking at him with an expression that made him realize, with a jolt, how much she sometimes looked like her mother. He told her, as plainly and gently as he could, that the project was in trouble, that he'd hit a problem he wasn't sure he could get past, that it might not work out. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she left the kitchen and came back holding her piggy bank, the ceramic one shaped like a panda that had sat on her dresser for as long as either of them could remember, heavy and serious with accumulated birthday, money, and tooth fairy coins, and the small allowances she had been carefully depositing for over a year. She set it on the table in front of him. "I have $147 in there," she said. "I counted last week." Ethan looked at his daughter. He looked at the piggy bank. He felt something move through him, that he did not have a word for, something between grief and gratitude, and a fierce, aching love that had no adequate expression. "I can't take your money, Lil," he said. And she looked at him with the kind of calm certainty that 8-year-olds sometimes achieve when they understand something more clearly than the adults around them. And she said, "I know you can't keep it, but I can loan it to you, and I know you'll pay me back. Because you always do." She paused. "I believe you'll fix it, Dad. I really do." He did not sleep that night. But by morning, he had a plan. The plan started with a phone call to a man named Marcus, a master electrician who specialized in exotic vehicles and had done work for some of the most valuable cars in private collections across the region. Ethan had met him twice at automotive events and had found him to be direct and knowledgeable and, crucially, someone who responded to genuine mechanical passion rather than the size of a checkbook. He explained the situation honestly, the project, the setback, the budget. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Marcus said, "Send me the photos." Ethan sent the photos. 20 minutes later, Marcus called back and said, "I'll come Saturday. I'm not charging you labor. You pay for parts." That was the first crack in the dam. By the weekend, the garage had a different character. Marcus came Saturday morning and worked through Sunday afternoon. And over those 2 days, he and Ethan rebuilt the damaged sections of the electrical system with a precision and speed that Ethan could not have achieved alone, not in his current knowledge base, not in his current time frame. A parts dealer named Gary, who ran a small shop 2 towns over, and who had followed the progress through a mutual acquaintance, arrived Saturday afternoon with a box of components at a cost he described as "whatever you can manage later." A fabricator named Dennis, who had heard about the project through the regional car community that moves on word of mouth and shared enthusiasm, and the particular joy that people who love cars feel when one of them is being saved rather than destroyed, drove 3 hours to spend a Sunday helping Ethan address the sill repair with a level of carbon fiber technique that Ethan had never seen performed in person, and that changed, permanently, his understanding of what composite repair could achieve. The word had spread through a community that Ethan had not known was watching, through forums and group chats, and the informal networks of people who love machines and recognize, when they see it, someone doing something real. Nobody had filmed anything yet. Nobody had posted anything. But people knew, in the way that people who care about the same things always seem to eventually find out, and they came with their tools and their time and their willingness to be part of something that felt worth being part of. Ethan accepted every offer of help with a gratitude that was almost physical, a loosening of something in his chest that had been tight for longer than he realized. The car began to respond. The electrical system, rebuilt now with proper technique and properly sourced components, initialized without error for the first time. Watching the dash cluster light up all those indicators and displays, flickering to life like a face becoming conscious, Ethan pressed his hand briefly against the carbon fiber and allowed himself to feel something he had been too cautious to feel before. Real hope. The headlights came on 3 days later, during a late-night session when Ethan connected the final section of the front lighting harness and hit the switch, almost without thinking, and the twin LED arrays blazed into the darkness of the garage with a brightness that made him stumble backward a step and then stand very still for a long moment, looking at them, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. He texted Lily a photo from the garage at 11:45 at night, and she replied at 11:47 because she was still awake, as he'd suspected, with a single line of exclamation points that made him laugh out loud in the empty garage. Day 28. 2 days before the deadline Ethan had set for himself, which he had been keeping not because anyone else was watching but because the discipline of a deadline was the only thing that had kept the project from expanding into something he could not contain. The car was, by every measure except the most important one, finished. The bodywork had been straightened and filled and primed and painted not to factory standards, not quite, but to a standard that made people who saw it pause and look again. The interior had been painstakingly cleaned and repaired, the torn sections of the custom leather replaced with material that Ethan had sourced and had a local upholsterer match with a skill that he'd repaid in full engine diagnostics on the man's personal truck. The suspension was rebuilt. The braking system was rebuilt. The transmission fluid had been replaced, and the gearbox had been tested through its full range of function on an improvised rig that Ethan had constructed himself from components in the garage, because he was not going to attempt to drive this car until he knew with certainty what the drivetrain was doing. Everything worked. Everything, except the engine, had not yet been started. The audience for the first start attempt was small. Marcus, Dennis, Gary, and Lily, who had been brought to the garage by Mrs. Caldwell and stood at the edge of the bay with her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of someone who is bracing themselves for news they care deeply about. Ethan sat in the driver's seat the first time he had sat there and felt the leather beneath him and the wheel in his hands and the particular silence of a machine that has not yet been asked to speak. He pressed the start button. The starter motor engaged. The engine turned. And then it stopped. No ignition. The garage went very quiet. Ethan got out without a word and began checking systems methodically, moving through his mental list with the focus of someone who has learned to treat failure as information rather than defeat. It took him 40 minutes to find it. A crankshaft position sensor that he had replaced during the reconstruction, that he had tested and confirmed as functional, had apparently shifted slightly in its mounting during the reinstallation of the surrounding components, placing it just far enough out of alignment to prevent the engine management system from establishing the correct timing reference. It was, in the full context of everything that had gone wrong and been fixed over 30 days, a minor thing. A 20-minute fix, but it was nearly 11 at night, and Lily needed to go home, and Ethan told them all to come back tomorrow. He worked alone until 2 in the morning adjusting and confirming the sensor position, then slept for 4 hours, then spent the day at his regular job thinking about nothing else. That evening, day 29 by his count, one day before his self-imposed deadline, everyone returned. Lily stood in the same spot as before, same posture, same crossed arms, same expression of careful hope. Ethan got into the car. He sat for a moment with his hands in his lap, and he was aware, in some part of himself, that was not focused on the mechanical task, that this moment meant something that was only partly about the car. Then he pressed the start button. The starter engaged. The engine turned, and then in a sound that started as a mechanical shudder and rose through registers until it became something that filled the entire garage and spilled out into the December night air, a sound that was power and precision, and the particular voice of a 4-liter twin-turbocharged V8 that has been brought back from silence, the McLaren 720S started. The sound lasted perhaps 3 seconds before Ethan killed the throttle. 3 seconds of engine note that sounded, in that small garage, like the end of a very long argument. Ethan sat with his head bowed for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. Across the garage, Lily had both hands over her mouth and was crying openly, silently, in the way that children cry when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and are finally allowed to let it go. Marcus said something quietly that no one else heard. Dennis put his hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. Gary, who had driven 40 miles on a Wednesday evening to be present for this moment, clapped 3 times slow, deliberate claps, and then stopped, because there did not seem to be anything else to add. The video that changed everything was not planned, not produced, and not intended for any audience larger than the 100 or so people who followed the account of the automotive enthusiast who posted it. He was a friend of Dennis's named Chris, who had been present for several sessions in the garage, and had filmed short clips on his phone purely out of the instinct that says some things should be documented. He edited them together on a free application over the course of an evening, the car arriving on the flatbed, the stripped chassis on the lift, the electrical system being rebuilt, the headlights coming on, the moment the engine started, and posted it with a title that he chose because it was simply the most accurate description of what had happened. Single dad rebuilds, totaled McLaren, in 30 days. He posted it at 11:15 on a Thursday night and went to sleep. By Friday morning, The clip had been viewed 40,000 times. By Friday evening, it had passed 180,000. By Saturday afternoon, when Ethan first heard about it from a colleague who showed him his phone during a lunch break, it had cleared 1 million views and was accelerating. The automotive forums were in a specific kind of uproar that only happens when something genuinely unexpected occurs in a space where expertise is closely guarded and skepticism is the default posture. Forum members who had spent years arguing about whether a totaled supercar could theoretically be restored to driving condition were now watching documented evidence that one had been, by a single person, in 30 days, in a rented garage bay in Ohio. The debate was heated, and the verification was rapid. People who knew McLarens examined every frame of the video and emerged, one by one, with the same conclusion. The work was real, it was sound, and it was extraordinary. The responses multiplied. Automotive journalists reached out. Restoration specialists made public comments. Collectors posted their reactions. People who had never cared about cars watched the video because someone they trusted had described it as the most satisfying 4 minutes on the internet and found themselves unexpectedly moved not by the car, but by the man and the child in the garage and the sound of that engine starting after 30 days of doubt. The headline that spread furthest was the simple one: "Single dad rebuilds totaled McLaren in 30 days." There was something in that headline that functioned like a story in itself, the compression of effort and time and identity into 9 words that people shared because it made them feel something, even if they couldn't immediately say what. Ethan's phone, which he kept face down on the workbench while he was in the garage, vibrated more or less continuously for 72 hours. He answered the calls he could and ignored the ones he couldn't, and felt, throughout, a slightly surreal sense of dislocation between the person he had been 3 days ago, the man who had sat alone in the garage at midnight wondering if he was out of his mind, and the person the world was suddenly, loudly interested in. He told Lily about it over dinner on Saturday evening. She looked at him for a moment, processing, and then said, "People are surprised that you did it?" And Ethan said yes, that was more or less the situation. And Lily said, "But I'm not." In a tone that made it clear, she found this distinction obvious and slightly baffling, and went back to her dinner. The message arrived through a mutual contact, a lawyer who handled transactions for several high-net-worth individuals in the region, and who had been asked to reach out on behalf of a client who had seen the video and who wished, if possible, to meet the person responsible for the restoration. The message did not include the client's name. It did not need to. The lawyer's association with Victoria Hayes was known in certain professional circles, and the mutual contact who forwarded the message to Ethan added a note that simply said, "This is the original owner. She wants to come see it." Ethan read the message 3 times. Then he called back and confirmed a time. Victoria Hayes arrived at the garage on a Tuesday morning in a black SUV that parked precisely, 2 of her team members waiting by the vehicle while she walked into the garage alone. She was dressed simply dark trousers, a gray wool coat, low heels, and she moved with the deliberate composure of someone who has learned to manage the fact that people watch her. She stopped just inside the bay door and looked at the car for a long time without speaking. The McLaren 720S sat under the lights of the garage in its restored volcano orange finish. Its carbon fiber accents detailed, its stance correct, its presence, that particular presence that great machines have, the sense of compressed potential entirely intact. Victoria walked toward it slowly. She crouched at the front, examining the carbon work. She ran one hand along the roofline. She opened the driver's door. It swung, with the precise, engineered resistance that McLaren doors are known for, and she closed it and opened it again, as if confirming something. Then she stood upright and turned to face Ethan, who had been watching from across the garage, and she said, quietly, "How?" It was not quite a question, Ethan told her. He took her through the 30 days in the order they had happened: the assessment, the plan, the sourcing of parts, the electrical failure on day 10, Lily and the piggy bank, Marcus and Dennis and Gary and the community that had assembled itself around the project. He did not embellish, and he did not minimize. He spoke the way people speak, when they are telling the truth about something that cost them something real. Victoria listened. She was the kind of listener who does not move much, who gives you the sense that you have her complete attention and has had it since you began. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She gave you her savings." It was not a question either. Ethan said yes. Victoria looked at the car again. Then she named a number, a purchase price, offered directly and without preamble, for the McLaren, as restored. The number was, by any measure, far beyond what the project warranted on pure cost accounting. It was a number that accounted for something the market does not normally price. What the thing meant, and what it had taken to bring it back. Ethan looked at her. He said he would need to think about it. She said, "Of course." And then she said, "But before you decide, there's something else I'd like to discuss." The something else was this. Victoria knew people. She knew the kind of people who owned machines like this one, and others rarer ones, older ones, machines of historical significance that required the kind of care that genuine expertise and genuine passion could provide, and that very few shops in the country were actually equipped to offer. She had, over the years, been frustrated by the scarcity of that combination, the technical skill and the devotion that a restoration, done properly, required. She had also, after watching a 4-minute video on a Thursday evening, concluded that she had found it in a garage bay in Ohio, in a 38-year-old man with grease under his fingernails, and an 8-year-old daughter who had handed him her piggy bank at midnight. She was prepared, if Ethan was interested, to make introductions, to connect him with a network, to provide, if he chose to expand, the kind of investment that would allow him to do what he was clearly built to do, at the scale it deserved to be done. She was not asking for a return on that investment, in any conventional sense. She said simply, paying a debt she felt she owed to the car, and to the man who had believed in it when no one else would. The months that followed moved with the particular momentum that happens when the right work meets the right attention at the right time. Ethan accepted Victoria's offer to sell the McLaren. He accepted her introductions. He did not accept a business partnership. He had thought about it carefully and concluded that what he was building needed to be his, wholly and without complication, at least until he understood its shape. But the introductions she made opened doors that he had not known existed into a world of collectors and curators and enthusiasts, whose relationship with their machines was as much about history and craft and emotional significance as it was about market value. A man in Connecticut with a collection that included 3 Le Mans-class racers from the 1970s contacted Ethan directly, having been referred by Victoria, and offered him a contract to assess and restore a Ferrari that had been sitting unfinished in his climate-controlled garage for 11 years. Ethan drove to Connecticut on a Saturday to see it. He drove home on Sunday with a signed agreement and a deposit check. The rented garage bay became, over the following year, a proper facility, a converted industrial space with 4 lifts, a spray booth, a dedicated electrical diagnostic station, and a small office from which Ethan managed the projects that now arrived faster than he could accept them. He hired Dennis first, which felt correct, and then 2 other technicians whose credentials he verified personally and whose work he supervised directly. He was not the kind of business owner who delegated the things that mattered. He was present, daily, on the floor, often with tools in his hands. The clients who sought him out, and they came increasingly by word of mouth and reputation, the way the best business always does, were not looking for the cheapest option. They were looking for someone who understood, at a level that went beyond technical competence, what a significant car meant to the person who owned it. Ethan understood this in a way that no amount of training could teach, because he had felt it himself, in a salvage yard in November, looking at a totaled supercar and seeing something that no one else could see. Lily, who was 9 now and then 10, adapted to the changes in their life with the same equanimity she had always brought to things she could not control and chose not to resist. The apartment gave way to a house, modest, on a quiet street, with a backyard where she could keep the small garden she had always wanted. The school she transferred to had a science program she had been interested in for 2 years, and she joined it immediately and thrived in the way that children thrive when they are finally in the right environment. She visited the shop regularly, sitting in the office doing homework while her father worked, occasionally wandering out to the floor to look at whatever was currently on the lift, asking the kind of questions, specific, technically curious, persistently focused, that made Dennis and the other technicians look at each other and raise their eyebrows, and occasionally wonder if they were being outpaced by a 10-year-old. She probably was. She had Ethan's instincts and Claire's precision, and the combination was formidable. Ethan kept one thing from the McLaren restoration that he did not sell, and did not display, and did not discuss at events or in the interviews that came, over time, with increasing frequency. It was a small section of the original carbon fiber sill, the damaged section that he had cut away during the structural repair, a piece roughly the size of a paperback book, its edges trimmed clean, and its damaged face left as it was, bearing the evidence of the impact that had been the beginning of everything. He kept it on the shelf above his workbench in the shop, where he could see it every day. When people noticed it and asked what it was, he said it was a reminder. If they pressed further, he explained. Most of the time, he didn't need to press further, because people who cared enough to ask were usually the kind of people who understood the answer when they saw it. On an evening in late autumn, almost exactly a year after the delivery of that flatbed, almost exactly a year after he had stood in this same space and looked at the same wreckage and felt the fear and the calculation and the particular quality of hope that is almost indistinguishable from certainty if you hold it correctly. Ethan stood in the doorway of his shop after everyone else had gone home and looked at the space that had grown from a rented bay into something real, something his, something that had a name now, and a reputation, and a future. The lights were on over the current project, a 1982 Porsche 911 that had been found in a barn in Vermont and was now, piece by piece, becoming itself again. The tools were hung correctly. The floor was clean. The place smelled of metal and solvent and effort, which is the smell of work done with intention. Lily was sitting in the office chair doing homework. She had her mother's habit of pushing her hair behind both ears when she was concentrating. She looked up when she heard him in the doorway and said, "You okay, Dad?" And Ethan looked at his daughter, and at the shop, and at the piece of carbon fiber on the shelf that had started everything, and said, "Yeah, Lil. More than okay." She gave him the look that meant she already knew that, and had known it for a while, and had been patient while he caught up. "I told you," she said simply, and went back to her homework. The McLaren 720S had taken 30 days to rebuild. That was the story people shared, the headline that traveled, the fact that made strangers lean forward and listen. But the story underneath that story was something quieter and harder to compress into a headline, that a man who had lost everything that made him feel certain had found, in the specific and demanding work of bringing a broken thing back to life, a way to rebuild himself at the same time. That a child who had handed her father her savings in a ceramic panda piggy bank at midnight had done something that no amount of money could have replicated, because what she had given him was not $147, but the belief of a person who knew him completely and had no doubt that the people who had seen only wreckage had been looking with the wrong instrument. The car was the car. The real restoration was everything else. Some people look at a broken thing and see the end of its story. Others look at the same broken thing and see the place where the real story begins. Ethan Walker was the second kind of person, and he had spent 30 days in a garage in December, proving that the difference between those two ways of seeing the world is not a matter of luck or resources or talent alone. It is a matter of staying when everything suggests you should go, of believing when the evidence is against you, of being the person who, when a child hands you her savings and says, "I believe you'll fix it," proves her right. The McLaren was given back its life in 30 days. The life that was truly given back, the one that was worth far more and that will last far longer, belonged to a father and his daughter in Ohio, in a garage with fluorescent lights and grease-stained walls, where a broken thing became, against all reasonable odds, something whole again,